My name is Suzanne Lynch. I'm Associate Editor with Politico, based here in Brussels. And I'm delighted to be introducing and interviewing, in a sense, our next speaker, Gideon Skinner, who's Head of Politics at Ipsos UK and Ireland. So he's going to be sharing some new research, some new information about public perceptions around these issues. Just a couple of housekeeping notes. There will be slides, but do not fret. They will be available on the EU UK Forum website afterwards, so no need to be frantically writing and making sure you don't miss anything. And also, we should have time left towards the end for questions. So make sure you keep those questions front and centre of your minds as we hear from Gideon. So with that, I'll give the platform to Gideon.
Thank you very much, Suzanne. Thank you, Paul, for the invite. Thank you, everybody, for coming along to hear me speak. Just check nothing's falling off. Check the slides working. Excellent. Okay, we've started well. So my name is Gideon. I have worked at Ipsos, which is a multinational research firm that many of you will be aware of. I've worked there for many years, focusing on attitudes to politics and current affairs in the UK, but also abroad. And I'm going to take you through where the UK and EU publics are in terms of some of the challenges that they face, what they think about the EU-UK relationship and Brexit, and their priorities for the future. And then we'll have scope for some questions afterwards. So please dive in. But first of all, 2025 is a good year to be having this conversation. There's lots of anniversaries that are important both to Europe and to the UK. It's the 80th anniversary of the end of World War II, and we know that peace and security remains a key driver in European publics, especially attitudes towards the EU and what they want the EU to focus on. It's the 40th anniversary of the original signing of the Schengen Agreement. I need to brush up on my geography, apparently a small town outside Luxembourg, Wikipedia tells me, that continues to have an impact on what people think, what people value about the EU, but also some of the concerns that we've seen about it and the challenges that this has created that the EU and the UK are still having to work through. And finally, of course, it's the 5th anniversary of what we're mostly going to be talking about today, which is Brexit. For those of you who are interested, an 80th anniversary is an oak anniversary, a 40th anniversary is a ruby anniversary, and a 5-year anniversary is a wooden anniversary. I'll let you take away from that what you will. But 2025 is a good year to be thinking about these things from another point of view. At Ipsos, we call the 2020s the Restless decade, where trends that we've seen in the first 20-odd years, the first couple of decades of this new millennium, have really started to accelerate. Of course, it started with a pandemic and the massive disruption that had on everybody, on society, on politics, on economics. But throughout we've seen economic concerns. 2024, many of you know, the year of democracy, more elections than we've ever seen before in the globe, and incumbents being punished by citizens' experiences of inflation and the cost of living. We've seen the rise of new powers, both kind of domestically, we've seen across democracies the rise of new movements, and also internationally new players on the stage. And then we're still having to deal with social concerns, social unrest and divisions, and of course the impact of climate change on many people that we see all the time in different countries. And that's all feeding through into a real sense of concern, unrest, and dissatisfaction around the world. We are very definitely living in interesting times, but that people don't feel comfortable always doing that. So, for example, only around half of people across 15 EU countries, and similar proportion in Britain, think that are certain that globalization is good for them, and that's less certain than we see in other parts of the world. Just over half say they'd like their country to be the way it used to be, kind of a nostalgia for the past. We've seen, for example, in Germany that grow significantly over the last few years. It's even higher in Britain, always been a bit of a country for nostalgia. We see 3 in 4 people worried about the pace of change. They, again, across Europe and across the UK, thinking that the pace of change is too fast. And again, that's something, that feeling is intensified over recent years. And we see that in kind of new areas too. I mean, despite all the hopes for AI, over half of people, again, across Europe and the UK, are worried that technological progress is going too far, has the potential to destroy our lives. Again, that's something that's increased considerably across a range of different European countries over the last few years. So there's real kind of concern, doubt, and worry out there. So what does that all mean for Brexit and the future of the EU-UK relationship, especially given what we see elsewhere around the world? Well, first of all, it's worth pointing out that actually, despite Brexit and in the years since Brexit, the EU and Europe has remained, according to Britons, the most important relationship that we have. We also see that, for example, when we talk about trade specifically, we asked a survey on trade and priorities for trade last year, and a similar proportion of people, around about half, just under half, said that it was more important to focus on trade with Europe than, for example, trade in the US. In fact, we've seen the proportion of people who say that Europe is the most important relationship to the UK increase slightly, just in our most recent poll for the forum. Perhaps, who knows, maybe that's in response to recent events that's happened in America and elsewhere. We know that the public aren't always very favourable in the UK and in Europe to Donald Trump. But that feeling has grown and it's persisted that Europe is the most important relationship to the UK. And we see that in other data as well. We see, for example, a growing sense that the EU and the UK have common interests. So 36% of people 36% of Britons think that the EU and the UK have interests that are mostly the same. That's up 7 points from 3 years ago. And that's, there's higher proportion than the proportion of people who think that the UK and the US have got interests in common, which has actually slipped. At the same time, it's only around 1 in 3 people who think that we've got interests in common. There's still clearly a bit of persuading to go out there that there is more that we could do and that there is more cooperation that we could do. But broadly, that sense that the EU is important to Britain, that there are areas that we can work on together, is growing. Why is that happening? One of them is that there is a kind of broad consensus that Brexit hasn't delivered amongst the UK. So around about half of people say the original decision was the wrong decision. They feel that Brexit has made their daily life worse, which has gone up significantly over the last few years, as you'll have seen if you looked in Brussels Playbook this morning. And half of Britons think that Brexit has been more of a failure than a success. In fact, as an aside, there is one person who is blamed by Britons both for Brexit's failures and also given the credit for the minority who thinks it's a success, and that's Boris Johnson, who still slightly looms over this debate, but he still gets a lot of blame for the failures and some credit for the success. So people don't think it has delivered. and there's a kind of a real concern that it hasn't given what people were hoping for. At the same time, you shouldn't go away with the view that that necessarily means that people want the whole debate reopened. That level of regret is not shared by everybody. So, for example, only 1 in 4 Leave voters think that Brexit has been mostly a success. So, only a minority of Leave voters think that, taking everything into account, it's going to be clearly more positives than negatives. They don't think it has delivered either. But at the same time, 7 in 10 of them still think it was the right decision. So although there's a relative consensus that Brexit hasn't been a success, there are still divides, there's still polarisation along party lines, along EU referendum lines about reopening the whole debate. But nevertheless, there is scope to do a bit more. So if we're thinking about a reset of EU-UK relations and what people want to see in the future, what do the public want that to concentrate on? Well, firstly, it's got to work for both sides. People don't think it's been great for the UK, but they don't think it's been great for the EU either. So around 4 in 10 in Great Britain and around 4 in 10 in a survey that we carried out across the whole of the EU think that Brexit hasn't worked very well for the EU either. So there is a bit of scope on both sides of the channel to think about how we can improve things and how we can make this new relationship work better. And what do people want that new relationship to focus on? There's a few key clear signs. For Britons, it's around trade, it's around business investment, it's around acting on illegal immigration, particularly for those who are Leave supporters and Conservative and Reform UK supporters. So that idea of acting on immigration, one of the issues that the Minister spoke about just now, is key to show, if you're trying to show there's a ways in which the EU-UK relationship can develop and to reach out across all sides of the political argument in the UK, immigration is key, but top is trade. Trade, investment, immigration, crime and safety. And there's a similar pattern when we ask European citizens what they think. So we asked Europeans who don't think that Brexit has delivered for the EU, we asked what they thought was bad about it. And you get a similar pattern around the economic issues coming top. So half saying it's led to reduced trade, it's led to increased taxation or duties on goods to the UK. But other issues as well that maybe come up a little bit higher for the EU, so issues around freedom of movement and so on. So there's a clear focus that the public want this new relationship to focus on trade, improving the economic challenge that the Minister talked about before. For Labour, that they've called it their defining mission to improve economic growth, and that's something that's going to be shared across the EU as well. And so there is some permission amongst the publics to act on some of this. There is a level of support. Around half of people say that they would, in the UK, say they would support Britain joining at least some form of customs union. Maybe not, quote, capital T, capital C, the customs union, but at least some sort of pan-customs area, actually even if that involves, say, free movement of young people. People will accept that. There are, though, still other red lines in public opinion when it comes to customs union, though. So, for example, there's definitely people do not like the idea of needing to adopt the euro, if that's the price of joining customs union. Nor do they like. I know it's just it's one of those small issues. Doesn't necessarily affect lots of people, but it creates quite a lot of concern in the public eye. Nor is there much support for joining a customs union if it meant increasing access to fishing waters. So there's still some sort of, there's still concerns out there. There are still areas where we need to know that the public is going to bridle, but there is overall an openness to developing the relationship. But just lastly, despite all that, the challenge for leaders and institutions, and for those of you in this room, in terms of we're thinking about how we're going to deliver these benefits that people want to see from the EU-UK relationship, and despite the fact that we know that the public thinks that it's gone badly and that they want to see it improved, despite the fact that we know that the public thinks it's important, and despite the fact that we know what the public wants us to get on with, there is a falling level of confidence that leaders will actually get on to deliver it. So in the UK, only 1 in 3 people are confident that Britain and the European Union, both sides, will work together to deliver a satisfactory outcome on their priorities. Half of people lack confidence, and that has dipped over the last 2.5 years. So we know what we want, and we want it to be better, but we have less confidence in the governments to work together to achieve this. And that's the challenge facing both sides. So where does that all end? And then we can have some questions. So first of all, I can't really stress the context, the importance of the context enough. Both the EU and the UK are facing restless, dissatisfied publics. There is a strong sense out there that the traditional system is not working for ordinary people. You've seen real and growing concerns over the future and pace of change, mirrored by a sort of a sense of nostalgia, of looking back, of feeling that people want their countries to be, quote unquote, the way they used to be, a sort of a comfort in the past. And real kind of, both on the social, societal and personal level, concerns and tensions for the future. And that underpins much of what people are thinking about, because for the public, we know that the EU and the UK relationship, it's not the most important thing to them. They have other issues on their plate, but it's about how do we create a narrative for this relationship that shows that it is delivering on some of these levels of concern. But they want us to do something because broadly Britain's and EU citizens think that Brexit hasn't delivered, and there is an openness to a closer relationship. There is permission to develop that relationship a bit more and look for ways for closer working amongst the public. Having said all that, as I said, there are still some relatively clear red lines in public opinion, or at least where it's going to be harder to get people to agree on some sides of the fence, and those divisions still exist. So people don't necessarily want the whole question reopened, but there is permission to develop that relationship and increase cooperation a little bit more. And particularly where people want that to focus on are trade, investment, immigration and crime. And probably from the EU side, we might add things like freedom of movement, climate change in there as well. But the trouble is there are doubts that that will be delivered, and that reflects the experience of kind of many people across Europe and the UK in terms of concern over how things have gone over recent years. And that's the challenge, showing that these priorities can be delivered on. Okay, thank you very much. That's where I am.
That was really fascinating, Gideon, and a really good kind of starting point for the day, I think, to frame what we're going to be hearing throughout the day. Just one of the points I'd like to kind of dig into a bit more, just with the news cycle the way it is at the moment, and Keir Starmer was here last night trying to, handle this tightrope between the US and the EU. And it was fascinating, the figure that showed that by a long shot, Europe is still, the EU is still seen as the most important relationship for Britain's. Quite 47%, I think it was, compared to 21% in the US. And this survey was taken just last week, like since the Trump inauguration. Yeah. So is that a new trend, or is there any sense of in what way do they see that relationship? Like, is it just a relationship generally, or is it specific aspects?
Some of that is consistent with what we've seen in the past. So as I showed you, the kind of, there's generally been a sense that the EU has been more important to people. We've seen that in our work on trade as well. We've actually seen that in some of even our longer term trends. If you go back, go back to the 80s, it was different. You might have seen the Commonwealth higher, but in relatively recent political history, people have seen the EU as important. That doesn't mean that, and we see that in trade. But that doesn't mean, and I think there has been maybe a bit of a boost since the Trump inauguration, because we know that people are worried about the impact that might have on global stability, on trade with the US, for example. At the same time, we also know, when we do similar things, looking at the UK-US relationship, there is a strong sense that people want to believe in that special relationship, and there'll be a little bit of selfishness in this as well, as we'll see, as we would see actually, I'm sure, if it happened if we were asking the EU publics as well. So we asked a question about potential tariffs. Excuse me, my voice. We asked a question about potential tariffs at the end of last year, and Brits were definitely worried if it applied to the UK, but actually if tariffs applied to everyone else, including Europe, and not us, yeah, we weren't that bothered. So I wouldn't overstate them. I wouldn't overstate that. Yeah. People will want benefits from both.
Yeah. The other one I noticed was further on in the presentation. I think I wrote this down right, about priorities, and I noticed at the bottom of the list was for Britons making it easier for British citizens to study or work in the EU, which surprised me. It's right down at 11%. But on the other side, Europeans, number 2 was the issue as making it more difficult to live or work in the UK. So that seems to be asymmetric and would presumably play into the British negotiating hand, because they could say, well, the Europeans want to come to us more than our British people want to go to Europe. I was kind of surprised about that trend, about the free move, about ability to live and work in the EU, that it seemed to be quite low as a priority.
So I think that's a fair point. I think there is, even within the UK side or the GB side, when we look at the data in a bit more detail, there's quite a lot of divisions on that freedom of movement aspect. So it is much more important to the Remainers side, to the Remainer side of the argument, and to younger people as well. I think it's as much that maybe in the UK people feel just a bit less fussed. So for example, something like freedom of movement and the youth mobility plans, actually I think the data tends to show people would support that. So it's maybe just that again, there'll always be a bit of cakeism when you're asking the public about what it is what they want and what they don't want, and they will always want anything. But there isn't a sort of an instinctive negative view towards the youth mobility scheme or something along those lines. So it may be that it's just not something that the public are picking up on as like, this is a desperate thing that needs to be improved, in the way that they can focus more easily on trade. The
way, as you said, fish and the euro are redlined.
Yeah, exactly. Yes, exactly. they are much more touch points, at least in terms of public opinion is concerned.
Yeah. Any questions? Don't be shy. We should have a microphone in here. Yeah, thank you. And make sure to introduce yourself. So this gentleman here, yeah, 3rd row, yes.
Thank you.
And then,
is it switched on?
Yeah. Yes.
Can you hear me? Yes. I'm David Brew from the European Movement in Scotland. I also chair one of the Scottish universities. What I wanted to ask, we all know that Scotland and Northern Ireland voted predominantly to remain in the EU. I wondered, A, whether your sample size allowed you to draw any regional conclusions within the UK, because we all know that it's a very different set of polities in different parts. And the second question, which is related to that, is in terms of age stratification, whether there are any significant differences between different age cohorts that you draw out. I mean, the insights that you get from the presentation were very valuable, Gideon. But I'm interested in whether you've been able to stratify it at all, either on a geographical basis or on an age cohort basis.
Yeah, sure. So, I mean, the short answer is it's broadly as you'd expect. So, yes, you will continue to see Scotland. We have less data from Northern Ireland, but it wouldn't be surprising to, there'll be specific issues in Northern Ireland. But Scotland and London continue to be more pro-EU in their thinking, in the same way as we saw from the 2016 result. And we also see a kind of a clear age gradient, as we see in so many other things in politics. Actually, it's becoming more and more really the very oldest group. So it's like the 55 plus, even older than the 55 plus, who are the ones who are still where you have the sort of the strongest sense of leave feeling, or sort of still sort of Brexity feeling, anti-EU feeling is strongest amongst that group. But you can look at it in other ways as well. So we are seeing divides by sort of generational divides going on, particularly if we look at sort of Gen Z and sort of differences by gender within Gen Z. We're seeing that across a number of public issues. So, but broadly, there's a kind of the relationship you'd expect. So younger people, Scotland and London, most pro-EU in their thinking. But a lot of this stuff is it's shared by quite, there is a relative consensus that Brexit hasn't worked, for example. The issues around importance of trade, that's broadly shared.
Interesting. So over here, this gentleman over here.
Thank you very much. It's Andrew Hesselden here. I'm with Save Freedom of Movement and various other organisations that are to do with promoting mobility. I picked up on the same point. I know that freedom of movement continues to be important to Europeans, and there was an Omnisys poll in 2023 that revealed that 84% of Brits support mutual freedom of movement. So we can see there's lots of good support for youth mobility, but my question is the UK government misreading the room on mutual freedom of movement for everyone? Wouldn't that unlock a lot of the stalemate over Brexit?
So I think that's a really good question. And there is some support, certainly more support than opposition, I think, for free movement. But I think I can understand a certain amount of caution, because a lot will also depend on how it's framed. So if you're talking about freedom of movement, freedom of European citizens to move freedom of EU citizens to go to the UK, but also UK citizens to move to EU, particularly if you give it a youth aspect, there is less concern. But and I think there will be some levels of support. But we also know that immigration remains a kind of a key issue, particularly in terms of how the UK public thinks, but also in terms of EU citizens. Immigration and control, or lack of control over borders, is still a real kind of touch point in public opinion. I can see that, like, if the debate gets framed as much about losing control over borders, that would cause some. I could see how that would cause some political difficulties. At the same time, and I think Anand's report has looked at this a bit as well, that it may be that there's been so much dissatisfaction with how the UK government has dealt with immigration over the last couple of years since we've left Brexit, that. It may be that sort of Leave supporters, those on that side, maybe are starting to think actually the issue wasn't so much about the EU after all. So that may be softening some of that opposition as well.
Just at the back, the gentleman there.
Thank you very much. Tilman Kupfer of Coburg Consult. I mean, 5 years of Brexit also find some good coverage in the German news, and they interviewed in Deutschlandfunk people in Clacton-on-Sea, which is a very famous town with a lot of Brexit supporters at the time. And they interviewed people on the street and what they think, and many Leave voters, and many of them regretted to have voted for Leave. But still, they are strong supporters of Nigel Farage. So what do you do with that?
I suppose it's what do you do? I mean, like, I don't know. Well, what's the question? There is, I think there is some regret and changing of mind amongst Leave supporters, but it would be a mistake to exaggerate that or to conflate a sense that it hasn't worked, which there clearly is a sense that it hasn't worked or hasn't delivered. Certainly, at the very least, it hasn't been an outright success. It's pretty clear that people, even Leave supporters, don't think it's been an outright success. So but it would be a mistake to think that that means that they are all changing their minds and think it was the wrong decision in the first place. So they are slightly more likely to have changed their minds than Remainers have done. So it's sort of the balance is slightly on the Remain camp. But it's not as if lots of those people have suddenly changed their minds and think the original decision was a bad one. I think is the important point.
Hi, I'm Arnon Mellon from UK in a Changing Europe. Gideon, I'm over 55, so I'm going to be sceptical and prove you right, if I may. On the first thing, you have that long list of things that people might want from the EU, and I've always thought in polling, presenting those sorts of trade-offs is really dangerous and really misleading, because if you said, for instance, okay, people want a customs arrangement, and PS, you've got to go around and scrap all the trade deals you've signed, you'd get a different answer. So how can we be confident in those sorts of questions, given the fact that people just don't really understand what lies beneath them? And secondly, the other thing that Ipsos does famously, you do your issues tracker. And isn't it worth pointing out that on your issues tracker, Brexit has fallen completely off the scale, which means that people might have these beliefs, but they might not want to see their government spending an inordinate amount of time on Brexit, given that they've got so many other priorities that they put ahead.
And I'm nearly 55, so I'm also sceptical on some aspects. No, you're absolutely right. Of course, if you and this is partly also the point about the answer to the freedom of movement question. Yes, when we ask questions and we give, as we did, for example, when we talked about customs union, and you talk about, well, what if it meant joining the EU, the euro, or what if it meant greater access for EU fleets in UK fishing waters, you see how things change, and absolutely, that we can use polling more to look at that. We see it strongly in other areas. We see it in say attitudes to net zero, for example. We see when we start presenting people the trade-offs in terms of support for different net zero policies, particularly if you start talking about kind of personal economic impacts, you can see support fall. At the same time, if you talk about benefits, if you talk about co-benefits of net zero policy, so for example, it might improve your health or it might improve local levels of employment, you can see actually how you can build support as well. So it works both, it works both ways. Of course, these are sort of relatively simple top-line results that I'm giving you, but absolutely the framing of them will matter, and especially given your second point about, yes, it is certainly dropped off the agenda. It is not as important as it was before. I think partly that does give it has two lessons. It means people probably don't want to kind of create the furore and the division that it did, but it does also give a bit of permission and opportunity to develop the UK-EU relationship if you can show that it's having an impact on the things that people are worried about. So that's the point, is that, yes, Brexit is down, but economy is still high, cost of living is still high, impact on public services is still high, concern about immigration is still high. So the issue is about showing how this kind of EU-UK relationship can deliver on some of the things that people are concerned about.
Okay, thanks. We only have a couple of minutes. I'm going to take 3 questions here. This lady here and the gentleman there, and I saw somebody over here as well. Yes, here. I saw 3. And we'll take them together. So.
Thank you. Elizabeth Crossick from RELEX, and also President of the British Chamber EU, Chamber of Commerce EU. Thank you for that fascinating talk. 2 questions. One, back to youth mobility. And I think it's really important how we can up those statistics or those insights in maybe a better way, in the sense that you said, it's higher with Remainers and youth. But youth is the key to our future. I mean, they are the ones that will help us to innovate and all the rest. And they are the ones that are saying, we need this. And we've also got to listen to what the EU is saying. That's where, where negotiation lies. But if you couple it with fear of immigration, then you get an immediate knee-jerk reaction. So is there a way of bringing those statistics, the results, in a way to show, to strategize what that youth vote might look like, in terms of age, in terms of sex, in terms of spread across the country? Because I think we've got to pull those statistics out and figure out a way to decouple them from that overall fairly toxic debate. If we go down into that rabbit hole, we will not come out. So that's my first question. And my second question is, fish? Really? Why? Please explain.
Okay, you can think about that one. Yes, gentleman at the back.
Richard Rose. Two hot issues. Trade and security. The Prime Minister's view is he wants to have it both ways. There are questions about this. Have you asked, or if you did ask, if forced to choose between going with the EU or the United States on trade and tariffs, which would you choose? And equally on security, my own research shows that people have, pre-Trump, looked to Brits have looked to the EU on the economy and to the US for security. But
Okay.
what does your research show in the light of Trump?
Yeah. And finally, this gentleman here, final question. Yeah, yourself, yeah.
Yes, my name is Paul Christoffersen. I'm a former Danish permanent representative. Now, the title of this conference is New Relationship. And I'm really wondering if we are looking for a new relationship, is the recipe to rehash once more all the things we discussed in the Brexit negotiations and try to get, in some areas maybe, an improved result? Or should we rather look at the future, the things that were not present? We have security and defense in the new environment. We have artificial intelligence, for instance. We have climate, and not the climate as it was known when we had the negotiations, but climate now with Trump, drill, baby, drill. In general, if we were trying to concentrate on those areas, wouldn't that be a recipe for getting us closer together than redoing what we spent 5, 6, 7, or 8 years ago? I would include in my list also, what do we do with multilateral organizations? There are so lots of problems where we have the same interests.
Okay, thank you very much. So, final thoughts, Gideon.
So I think maybe I'd do it in reverse order. I mean, I think where the public are, they don't want to go back to 5 years ago, or whenever longer, 2016, 9 years ago. And they do want it to focus on things that are important to them now. But those things are, as we talked about, economy, immigration. I mean, I would include things like climate change. I think you're right that people will want to focus on that. It's about making it work, and it's about showing to people that people are going to be entirely up for cooperation, and like those are the easy bits, the bits that benefit both sides. Everyone's going to agree with. It's the more sticky ones that yes, people don't want to go back to the kind of those old divisions, but that doesn't mean that there aren't tricky trade-offs to negotiate. on trade and tariffs and defence and security. So we have asked on trade and tariffs what people prefer, and people generally do think it's more important to increase trade with the EU than the States. But as I said, they still value the United States relationship. And I suspect if you asked a question around security, I don't know the answers, but I wouldn't be surprised if the emphasis from the British public was the other way round. Despite the fact that we know that there is increased levels of concern about the impact of the Trump inauguration and the Trump presidency, although we haven't, need to see how those play out. So there is some concern there about what's happening with the new president, but even so, the US relationship will still be important to people, and Britain's will still have a relatively pragmatic relationship, a relatively transactional relationship to what they want to get from the relationship for the EU. On fisheries, I couldn't say, but it's clearly we know there are just these topics out there in public opinion that are a bit of a touch point, and it's no good. The important learning is where there are these kind of emotional stories. We can't just say to people, "Oh, you're wrong. Here are the facts. You're wrong." That doesn't change people's minds. We've got lots of experience of that type of argument not changing people's minds. What you need is an emotional argument that brings people along with you and explains how how what you want to do ties into some of the things that are important to them. But we can't just kind of dismiss some of these concerns because we don't think they're rational enough. And then, there, as I said before, there are clearly differences by age. I'm sure if people want to pay us to do large-scale surveys so we can look at that into more detail, we'd be very happy to do so. Again, I'd sort of, but it's important to have we need to understand the full nature of the relationship and the full nature of public opinion. I'm kind of assuming that most people in this room are going to be in favour of kind of increased levels of EU cooperation, I suspect, because you're attending here. But we can't just, if that's the case, you can't just concentrate on, these are the bits that bolster our argument. These are the bits that we know that young people are more in favour. We know that youth mobility, there is some level of support for this. You need to have an understanding of where the challenges in public opinion are, because they're just as important to you kind of building support and developing your narrative as where there's permissions as well.
Okay, well, on that note, that was a very good one. If there were some politicians here, I think they could take up that point about how to, no point in talking to the already converted in a sense. But thank you so much for that, Gideon. That was a really fascinating presentation and great questions and answers session. So thank you for your time. We're now going to have a coffee break, so don't go too far, as I say, but tea, coffee, etc. available in the foyer there. So thank you again, Gideon.